be doing that shit no more, man.
No, Mom, I don't know what to do. Oh, that's terrible. I gotta talk to the cop.
Although Jimmy was crying,
Fulham did that shit, bro.
crying his heart out, the officer spotted no moisture on his face at all. They decided to have him wait outside, away from the crime scene. Shortly after, Amy was placed on a stretcher and taken to the back of an ambulance. They rushed her to the ProMedica Herrick Hospital, just 2 minutes away. The EMTs were finished in the basement, so the officers headed back inside to do further investigation, getting Ashley ready for school.
Listening to music and making lunch and breakfast, smile on her face.
At around 7:30 a.m., Jimmy left for work and Ashley left for school, while Amy stayed home. Jimmy decided to leave work early, so around 12:30 p.m., he came home and took a nap. Then, at 2:45 p.m., the school day was over and it was time to pick up Ashley.
Ashley had a friend over, Kayla, after school. Amy picked her up, I was at bed, and they came here. She made everybody dinner, 6:30. We rolled out to take them to the game.
After a nice family dinner, everybody hopped in the car and drove to the Tecumseh High School for the football game. As mentioned before, Jimmy and Amy dropped off the girls and decided to head downtown to go bar hopping. They first went to Ember's Bar and Grill, then to JR's Hometown Grill and Pub shortly after. Investigators would later confirm this part of Jimmy's story by obtaining the security footage from JR's. Apparently, nothing seemed out of the ordinary until Jimmy brought up the idea of selling their house and moving down south. Since the family had just moved to Michigan from Florida 1 year earlier, Amy was not fond of this idea. She began texting someone on her phone and became dismissive of Jimmy's comments.
She said a couple times that, oh, that's not gonna work, and she's normally positive and was sort of down and negative, and we started to disagree about it, and she's like, you know, I hope that works out for you, and I'm like, what do you mean, me? I'm talking about our life, like, and this isn't hardcore planning, this is, like, you talking about, you know, our future, and she just, oh, I hope that works out for you.
Jimmy said that this comment sparked an argument between the two. This was also confirmed by this surveillance footage, which...
It don't even matter how much y'all argument was. Why the fuck is you driving the car? If anything, nigga, you walk home and let her drive the car. You let your girl just walk in the world and then let down the streets and shit.
Their house. Amy arrived home at 7:58 p.m. She grabbed an extension cord and then went down to the basement. At 8:05 p.m., Jimmy decided to go check on her.
She's petting Louie, one of our cats, and what the hell are you doing in the basement?
Apparently, Amy was angry at him for slamming the door in her face as they left the bar. But according to Jimmy, it was just an accident. He did forget to hold the door for her, but he didn't slam it intentionally. Amy didn't believe that it was an accident, so she started throwing insults at him, and the two proceeded to argue for about 10 minutes. Nothing good was coming from this argument, so Jimmy went back upstairs, leaving Amy in the basement with the extension cord. About 25 minutes later, at 8:40 p.m., Jimmy realized that it was time to pick up Ashley from the football game. Before he left, he went back to the basement to squash the beef with Amy.
And immediately do that, started, you know, check for a pulse. When I glanced down there, I saw there looked like a upturned kitty litter pail. Because I'm like, like I said, it was just so, sure.
The officer...
What, nigga? Like, bro, you talking about something you tried to squash the beef so she offed herself? Nigga, what? How y'all having an argument and then you said you come to the basement and your wife is dead? We trying to squash the beef, come to the basement. What? She is not finna just do it for argument. Women, bro, women go through a lot. This little shit right here, this probably...
This might happen, but Jimmy said that he could never have seen this coming.
You know, spent all night kind of thinking and playing back what triggered, what was... Has she ever tried anything like this before? Never had any ever, like, we live a healthy lifestyle.
You look like a buster.
Rock climbing 3 times a week in Ann Arbor. We, like, cook meals at home. We grow our own vegetables out here. Money trouble, no. I mean, this is like the pinnacle of, like, best job I've ever had. I make great money. She's a stay-at-home mom. She takes care of the 5 cats, the pool, and is there for my daughter doing sports and activities.
Sure. The officer then asked if he and his partner could do a more thorough search of the home, and Jimmy agreed. Wendy was visibly shaken up by the incident, but the detectives needed to know if Amy and Jimmy had a history of violent altercations.
Were your mom and dad fighting at all yesterday that you recall?
No, everything was fine.
When you left? Okay. Is there a history of like, fighting or arguing or anything like that? Nothing ever? Okay.
The officer also asked about Amy's state of mind, but Ashley said that even though her mom was a deeply introverted person, she had always been emotionally stable. This interview wasn't as fruitful as the officers had hoped, but shortly after, they were approached by several of Amy's family members. They said that Jimmy waited 14 hours to tell them about the incident. As soon as they heard the news, they rushed over to the police department because they had an abundance of useful information for the police. The investigators learned that back in 1997, when Amy was just 13, she had a son named Caleb. Her parents looked after Caleb while she attended high school in Ocala, Florida. By the end of high school, she began dating Jimmy, who had no problem becoming a father figure to Caleb. When Amy was 19, they had Ashley, and from that point on, Amy stayed home to take care of the kids while Jimmy worked. However, according to Amy's family, this wasn't her choice. They believed that Jimmy was a controlling husband who didn't want Amy to become financially independent. He would monitor everything the family did, from their social media activity to what they were eating throughout the day. He would also discipline the kids if he believed they were misbehaving, frequently taking things too far. Whenever Amy stood up to Jimmy, her opinion didn't seem to matter. Whatever Jimmy wanted, Jimmy got. So when Caleb turned 17, he left to stay with his grandparents. Jimmy retaliated, telling Amy that she was no longer allowed to speak with her family, including Caleb. One of the last times Caleb saw her was at his high school graduation a year before the incident. But other than that, Amy had minimal involvement in Caleb's life. All of this evidence was extremely damning for Jimmy. It wouldn't be a surprise if an abusive and controlling husband tried to murder his wife. But if
this nigga's weird. He's a bastard. I could tell from this nigga beard, bro. Look at him. I knew it was something up with this nigga's story. You feel me? Like, fuck.
Police wanted to bulletproof their case against Jimmy, they needed to answer one big...
And what is that?
Big question. What was Jimmy's motive? Unfortunately, before the investigators could answer this question, they received tragic news. On September 17th, 2018. After being unresponsive for 3 days, Amy was taken off. Despite all of Jimmy's torment, Amy seemed completely fine in her other conversations. This evidence strengthened the case against Jimmy, but the detectives still couldn't pinpoint an exact motive. That was until they looked through a conversation with a man named George. George was a married man from the East Coast that Amy had met online and had been texting for the past 3 years. Based on the explicit content of the messages, it was clear that they were having an affair. Even on the day of the incident, Amy and George were consistently texting and calling him.
That's how that shit go, nigga. If you can't control your man emotions and shit, my nigga, your bitch gonna start choosing, my nigga. You feel me? She said she don't care. Go ahead. When you say you want to go to Florida, she said go ahead. She already got in there on the side. You feel me? You feel me? That shit.
Each other. While Amy was having dinner,
I don't got nothing to say. This nigga.
George texted her saying,
This nigga's low key like,
I wish we could be together right now. At 5:29 p.m., Amy responded with, I'm excited to see you again. And remember when Amy began texting somebody during the argument at Jimmy's Grill and Pub? It turns out that she was texting George, even with Jimmy sitting directly beside her. From these findings, a new theory emerged. Perhaps Jimmy had caught a glimpse of these text conversations and was overcome with anger, which ultimately led to him attacking Amy in the basement. The investigators were eager to ask Jimmy some more questions, but they ran into a small problem. Jimmy was nowhere to be found. It turns out that just a few days after the incident, Jimmy and Ashley packed their belongings, including their 5 cats, and headed back to their hometown, Ocala, Florida, to stay with family. Thankfully, the authorities were easily able to get in touch with Jimmy to arrange another interview. He told them that he would be back in Michigan in a few weeks to grab some of his stuff. Since the Tecumseh Police Department had limited personnel and resources, the Michigan State Police had taken over the investigation, and Detective Larry Rothman was put on the case. During his stay in Florida, Jimmy had plenty of time to reflect on his relationship with Amy, and he was forthright with the detective about his shortcomings.
Wasn't so inner-focused and self-focused. Maybe we could have seen things that were going on that maybe could include me in what my life was so much turmoil that I couldn't even see it. I mean, that's how it feels. Like I don't even know who I am.
It's hard to believe this statement from Jimmy, because moments later, when asked to describe himself, he gives an awfully detailed answer.
Describe yourself. What kind of a person are you? I would say I'm a type A personality. I like structure, organization, I'm ambitious. Always seeking to improve myself and others around me. That's why all this is so pressing to me, is because like I have really taken measures in the last couple of years to like make sure that myself and my family were like mentally healthy, like pursuing things that got you the goal, like of helping others, being kind, making it, like I said, making the same thing, that type of person, and making a positive impact.
Without a doubt, Jimmy's obsession with creating the perfect family was immensely toxic. However, Jimmy seemed to take pride in this toxic behavior, framing it as a strength. He believed that his role in the family was to hold them to a higher standard. No matter how much Jimmy painted himself as an upstanding family man, the detectives weren't buying.
This nigga is not no leader.
Where you're at now, does anything pop out at you?
There's not no man to look up to. Nigga kill you. Nigga, you killed your wife.
What kind of issues? She struggled from social anxiety, so she's like that for years. She's just extremely shy, introverted person. She never developed relationships anymore in Ocala. She didn't have any friends. She was playing video games compulsively, had a World of Warcraft thing, that got out of hand. So she just sort of started isolating herself. And so I had taken measures to, when we got up here, to help her break up.
Jimmy is painting himself as a valiant savior, guiding his wife away from her bad habits.
Nah, just a confession right there.
But as we mentioned,
that's a confession. You keep saying I take measures and shit to build this little family and shit that you want. I'm really toxic as hell. Yeah. Even if I gotta, even if he gotta ex his queen to have that shit.
mentioned earlier, everybody who was close to Amy said that Jimmy was the main cause of her isolation. While asking Jimmy about infidelity in the relationship, he revealed
that nigga was cheating. That nigga was cheating too.
There was one time I went to the Isle of Man and hooked up with this chick. During marriage, you know she was unfaithful to you? I don't think that was possible. Why is that? She didn't seem to have the capacity to, talk to people, man. I mean, she was, incredibly introverted.
Clearly, Jimmy underestimated Amy's charm. Later in the interview, the detective set the record straight, bluntly telling Jimmy that Amy was, in fact, having an affair.
What was wrong with her affair? I don't think she had an affair. No, I have no idea. I wouldn't think it was possible. There's a lot of stuff that she had tried to delete there, but, I mean, we're talking, telling
seemed to be in denial, so the detective printed off some excerpts from Amy's conversations with George, some more risque than others.
And the chance lead up to the 14th, the same day that this happened. Clearly there was something going on between these two people.
As someone who had a say in every aspect of Amy's life, he seemed completely blindsided by her secret life with George. He wanted more answers.
Can you pull phone records to see if there's any numbers that I can see that I can recognize? It kind of like, to me, it's crushing to think that she has some, like I legitimately, I still don't all the way believe you guys. I don't, that she had to go ask you to do that. Like I said, this is the most shocking, process.
In a last-ditch effort to elicit a confession, the detective asked Jimmy if he would take a polygraph test. Jimmy agreed and maintained his innocence the entire time. Ultimately, the test results were inconclusive. The detective wrapped up the interview, less certain about Jimmy's involvement than before. But upon the moment that Officer Horn noticed how low the basement ceiling was, and he suddenly had an idea. Rothman reached out to a forensic engineering lab in Michigan and asked them to recreate the scenario Jimmy had supposedly stumbled upon. After many months of preparation, testing, and analyzing the results, the lab determined that under the same circumstances, her feet would have made contact with the ground. A different forensic pathologist reviewed the same test results, and they determined that her manner of death must have been a homicide. On October 16, 2020, Jimmy was charged with one felony count of open murder. This meant that if the case went to trial, it would be up to the jury to determine the degree of homicide Jimmy is guilty of, anywhere from involuntary manslaughter to first-degree murder. By this point in the investigation, it appeared that Jimmy, who was still staying with his parents in Florida, had moved on entirely. In fact, he even had a new fiancée, and their wedding was just 5 days away. But before they could tie the knot, Jimmy was arrested and...
Cause he was doing the same thing, man. They got a new wife already. He was just waiting. And they just go from family to family, women to women.
extradited back to Michigan. Once he was booked into jail, he was brought into a room to have his charges explained to him. When told that he could contact the investigators if he had any questions, Jimmy said something peculiar.
If you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of us, or they can contact us. Okay.
How you sleep at night?
Well, like I said, I don't understand that question.
Okay.
A few weeks later, at his arraignment hearing, Jimmy pled not guilty. His bond was set at $10 million, and he was put behind bars. Leading up to his trial, his defense attorney Daniel Guerin released this statement. Mr. Allen vehemently asserts his innocence in this case, as he had absolutely nothing to do with Amy Allen's tragic death. He cooperated with police throughout the 2-year investigation and provided evidence and statements showing his innocence from the very beginning. He has been in jail for nearly a year for a crime he did not commit, and he misses his family dearly. He is looking forward to the evidence finally being shown to a jury of his peers so they can see clearly that he is innocent and did absolutely nothing wrong. In September of 2021, 3 years after Amy's death, his trial began. Prosecutor Angie Borders kicked off the opening statements.
That shows that he had told police that night that he had watched.
One of the key witnesses for the prosecution was Amy's son Caleb. He told the court about an altercation with Jimmy while he still lived at home.
I stood up, pushed him against the wall, and there was a second of fear that...
Oh, this nigga Cable right here, grown as hell. How old is this nigga? 20-something, 30-something? This must be an old-ass story.
Came over me, and I realized what I was doing, and I let up, and then I was spun around, or maybe I turned around, and then I was choked from behind on the floor for multiple seconds. It felt like forever during the incident, and I was gasping for air, grabbing for anything, trying to get away from him.
But the more they got to know each other, the more eager they were to see each other in person.
Have you ever met Amy in person?
Yes, twice.
The first time the two met up was in spring of 2017 to grab
That's
some
all
coffee.
that's
The
all it
second
takes.
time was several months later when
That's
Amy
all it
met George
takes.
in a hotel room.
I was here for work, and she had some free time, so she came to the hotel.
So you're at a hotel.
Yes,
The things that happen at a hotel happen at the hotel.
some things, yes.
Apparently, George and Amy's love for each other only grew as time went on. Even on the day of her death, Amy showed no signs of wanting to slow down.
I wrote, I love you. And I wrote, I want more of you. And she wrote, I love you too. I'm ready to spend time with you in person. And I wrote, good. Let's do it. And then she wrote, end of October. And I wrote, I'm in.
When Amy was placed under intensive care, her blood alcohol
Your daughter gonna know that shit. Yeah. Get this nigga the book, man.
content was recorded at 0.09%, likely caused by the 2 or 3 drinks that she consumed at the bars that night. The defense said that this was proof of Amy's drinking problem, and that she wasn't as chipper as the prosecution had suggested. They also questioned the forensic pathologist who claimed that this was a homicide. To dispute this notion, the defense had actually reached out to their own expert, Dr. Francisco J. Diaz. According to Dr. Diaz, since there was minimal bleeding to the strap muscles of the neck, no petechiae, and no evidence of defensive-type injuries, he believed that Amy's death was not the result of somebody else's actions.
And you find the defendant guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder